There's quite a lot that we're unpicking, actually.
Yeah. It's good.
Which
It makes for a good conversation.
It does, doesn't it?
Most of my friends are neurodivergent. I love that. I love that they have perspectives on the world that completely turn things on their head. Why do we have to conform to all these silly conventions all the time? It's exhausting.
It's okay not to be feeling proud all the time. It's like when you hear people say, oh, you're dyslexic, what is your superpower? And I'm thinking, oh, well, no. And we hear that quite a lot, don't we? But you must have a superpower. And I think for me, that puts the pressure on that individual.
So something I knew was really important was to try and get as much kind of life experience and tips from other disabled people who had completely different disabilities to my own in the book. And so it's never going to be completely inclusive to everybody because, I mean, there's thousands of disabilities in the world, but I've tried to make it something that is relatable to as many disabled kids as possible, and that was something that was very important to me.
In this episode of My Words, My Book, we are joined by Cathy Reay. Cathy is a disabled writer and journalist and mum of 2, plus a very cheeky cat. She also works in educational publishing. How to be disabled and proud, or at least kinda sorta okay with it, is her first children's book. So Cathy, why did you become an author?
So I had an Instagram platform where I'd started sharing a bit about the discrimination and the barriers that disabled people face. And I'd been asked to write in newspapers a bit about that as well. And I really enjoyed that with my background in journalism. And I think I didn't know that I wanted to be an author specifically. I wasn't particularly called to that, but people kept messaging me and saying, oh, you should write a book, you should write a book. And then I was approached by some literary agents who all, wanted me to be on their books after reading things that I'd written. And I thought, oh, this could actually be quite cool. Maybe I'll make $1 million. Spoiler alert, I haven't. And let's give it a go. And so that's kind of how I fell into it, really. But I've always had a love for writing. I've always had a love for expressing vulnerabilities through words, but also expressing, like, imparting education and knowledge through words as well. And my kind of writing often does those things. It kind of expresses some vulnerability of myself, but it tells people about, hey, this is like this and this is like this and this is what you can do to help and whatever. And I really like doing that. I really like writing in that way.
Does that lean into your work because you're a journalist? And I wanted obviously to have some reflections on that in terms of your writing. What type of subjects do you write about? And in which publications have you featured in?
Sure. So after kind of the initial stages of the pandemic, when a lot of people were still at home, that's when I started being approached to write things in newspapers and magazines. They also, as I'm sure you'll recall at that time, were looking for more diverse writers in the wake of George Floyd and everything like that, and that extended out to disabled people and other marginalised groups. And so, I was called on by The Guardian, The Independent, the iPaper, and publications of that ilk to write about disability discrimination, disability politics, and also kind of one of my favourite things, like trash TV and movies and disability representation in TV and movies, which I really enjoy as well. And I say trash, but it's all meaningful. It all has a place. And yeah, so it just kind of came, it evolved naturally. I started doing it, and then I started pitching as well because I enjoyed seeing my name in these publications. And
As you do.
and sure, and also, more importantly, I guess I enjoyed the feedback I received from people, and when they kind of said, "Oh, I feel really seen by something you've written," or "I'm just so, appreciative of this, and you've put something into words that I couldn't express," and stuff like that. Like, that's very meaningful to me, and I wanted to do more of it. So I just kind of kept going. But when I got my book offer, I kind of scaled back on the journalism because I just couldn't do both at the same time, really.
It's a lot of work, isn't it, writing a book?
Mm.
Everyone thinks it's quite easy, but actually, myself being an author, even though my books are more picture books and non-fiction, fiction and non-fiction books, the amount of time it takes in terms of the editing, research, etc.
Absolutely.
Yes, yeah.
When I look at picture books, you know, people say to me, "Oh, why don't you do a picture book? That might be easier." And I'm like, actually, I think there would be a lot involved in that as well, because you have to sign off on everything. And you know, I have illustrations in my book. They're very small, by this wonderful illustrator, Jaleel Hudson. But you know, I still had to review and feedback, and it's a lot of work. And so I can imagine with a picture book, it would be a lot more than that.
It is actually, it is a lot more work
Yeah.
because you have to condense the words down. So you start off sort of quite big and you think, oh no, this is only 32 pages, and then you get smaller and smaller.
Yeah.
And then you have to, okay, which bits am I going to include? Which bits am I going to take out? But I think it's wonderful to hear that you are a writer. And like myself, I have written articles, but I'm not a trained journalist per se, not even a writer, because I am super dyslexic.
Right.
And in terms of your day job, I think that's quite interesting, I think, for the listeners and the viewers to hear about.
Yeah, I'll speak about that in a minute. I just want to kind of pick up on something you said. You said you're kind of not a writer because you're dyslexic.
No, what I said, I'm sorry. No, I'm not a trained writer.
Okay.
Is that
Okay.
basically I've never done a creative writing course. I've never done a journalism course. I've always just
Sure.
written from my heart, so
Yes.
to speak, if that
Yeah.
makes sense.
Yeah,
So
no,
I've
it
never
does.
ever gone to, done a degree or a master's in creative writing. I can't even remember what I got. It would have been CSEs then when I left school.
Yeah.
But then I know what's interesting there, I suppose this is a really great thread to share, because I always thought that being dyslexic, I wasn't any good in school. All eyes are on me now. I always felt that, and my sister was super academic. She was a straight ace student, as with most of my other siblings. I felt that I probably wasn't worthy, even in terms of how I was writing. And I remember there was one teacher who said, "But I can see Laura's got it there," but I wasn't able to write. And it's only, I would say, myself writing for publications in the education world in the last 20 years, the first brief that I was asked to write, the first brief that I was writing about was around Ofsted inspections, and I was like, yeah, but I can write. And I think that's quite interesting that the especially having an intellectual disability myself, and there's when I go into schools, into primary schools and secondary schools, and I'm doing an assembly, and I show a slide, I can't remember who the quote is by, and it says, "Don't let what you can't do interfere with what you can do."
That's lovely. Yeah.
So I think I've always been that writer. Yes, my spelling and grammar is still atrocious.
Sure.
But I think I've always been that writer. So that's why I was interested to hear your story into writing. And was there anything before lockdown? So anything pre 5 years ago?
Thank you for sharing that. I think that's really interesting. I think the publishing industry as a whole still has a long way to go in terms of the ableism and the barriers that are there for people with disabilities like dyslexia, dyscalculia, things like that. And so it's really interesting to hear that. I I also think that we're still very much a work in progress in what we expect writing to look like, what we expect a book to look like, and how it should be, rather than actually, you know, meeting the author where they are and going on that journey with them, no matter how different it looks to a different book. Um, and yeah, I think we've made a lot of progress in that area, but I think we've still got a way to go. It's still quite formulaic in a lot of places, and you're expected to adhere to a lot of writing standards that would just automatically leave out a lot of people.
And I think that's right. I was just reflecting there, Cathy, and actually, whose standards is it?
Yeah, exactly.
you know, who are we actually writing for? Because I think a lot of people are put off from writing because they feel it's a standard. In terms of what I was just saying previously, they think you need to have a degree, you need to have done a course in creative writing, etc., etc. But actually, this is, for many authors, it's their lived experience that they're sharing,
Right.
and that is their way of communicating. Are we saying that for everything to be put across, it has to be grammatically correct? Because actually, writing is being creative. So therefore, then, who says that it has to be grammatically correct? Because it's the message that's been received.
A long time ago, I was a teacher of English as a foreign language, and I'm really embarrassed to admit that I used to pull students up on spelling and grammar and things like that. And quite often the line was blurred between, did they not know it because they were still learning English, or did they not know it because they have dyslexia or something like that, right? And I just wasn't, I hadn't educated myself enough to distinguish the differences, but also I was bought into that. I bought into that idea of perfectionism. And actually, it's not about, for me anyway, it's not about correct spelling, correct grammar, perfect handwriting, um, perfectly cohesive text. It's just about, as I said, meeting the author and understanding the way that they go on that journey and following it through their eyes, through their writing. And our brains are amazing. Like when we're reading something and there's a typo or something, we will often correct it without even noticing the typo. So why would that be any different for someone writing a book? You know, we need to give people that grace to mess up.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that's a clear message, I think, for anybody who's going to be listening or watching this particular podcast episode, is don't let that put you off, because I always believe there is a publishing house out there who will take your work because it's different, you know, and I think that's very important. And I think now, why should every book have that same feel to it?
Yeah.
Why can't we have a book that's, you know, celebrates differences in writing styles as well? You know, excellent. It's actually making me think quite a lot, Cathy. So, yeah, so thank you very
Sorry, I
much.
went off topic
No,
there.
it's
I
not
know
off
that you were
topic because
asking about before, but
no, but I think it's a really good point too, because I've also too, this podcast is for the authors as well to share their opinions and their thoughts on writing and the publishing world, etc. Which leads me on to, what was your favourite book as a child?
my favorite book, I think, was The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Um, and it's such a classic story. I think I was so into adventure stories. I love The Secret Garden, and although they're quite problematic, The Famous Five and The Secret Seven. Um, and I just loved it because it was kids going on an adventure, and I wanted to have adventures. And I loved The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe because the film about that book came out when I was young, and so I really loved that. But also, more than that, there obviously is a wardrobe in that story, and as when I was a child, I had a very similar looking wardrobe in my bedroom, and I used to love pulling back the doors and putting my clothes to one side, and putting stickers on the inside and writing notes and kind of escaping a little bit in my wardrobe. And I imagined myself going into Narnia so much, and I just found that such a magical kind of um, a magical story that something so ordinary can transport you into this incredible world. And yeah, I used to love stories like that.
Yeah, it's a great book, isn't it? It's a classic. And I remember the film as well.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. And I think that's a great, in terms of that, myself as a reader, those books that offer you that escapism
Mm.
that you can just go into. And a book like that, as I said, it's still a classic now for many children and adults as
Yeah,
well
for sure.
to appreciate. So here we are, leading on to this amazing book, How to Be Disabled and Proud. And the illustrations done by Gillian Hudson are just absolutely amazing, and I love the different characters on the front. But I just think the way that the book is designed as well, it's just an amazing book. And I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, this is the first book in this genre of books, How to Be Disabled and
Yeah,
Proud.
it's definitely the first book in the UK about disabled identity for 8 to 12-year-olds. Yeah, for sure. Which is really cool, you know, and it was baffling to me that it didn't already exist. Um, but great that I get to do that.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. So, in terms of a brief overview, Cathy, of this book.
So, How to Be Disabled and Proud, it kind of has a three-pronged attack. It's primarily for disabled children who might feel, and that includes people who, children who experience any kind of disability, whether it's something that is apparent or non-apparent, whether it's something that's neurological or physical or whatever, or an illness. And it's a book that supports those children through that kind of tricky time of being 8 to 12 years old, where their bodies are changing, their friendships are changing, they're thinking about secondary school, they're thinking about different kind of, they're being introduced to all kind of new ideas of being what a preteen is. They're having all these emotions, like if you've seen Inside Out 2, we all know that, at this age, they start to experience these really complex and big emotions they don't know how to handle yet. Um, and it kind of helps kids, disabled kids, to navigate all of that, but also, I guess more importantly, through it, to feel kind of reassured by who they are. And it was so important to me because when I was a kid, I didn't have any literature on that. I grew up with two non-disabled parents, and my siblings weren't disabled either. And I had a couple of friends who were disabled, but I didn't have somebody holding my hand, I suppose. And I wanted this book to hold kids' hands and just kind of let them know that it's absolutely okay to be the way they are, that there's nothing wrong with them, and it's you can enjoy this time of your life, but here are some things you need to know while you're experiencing it. But it's also for caregivers, because the large number of caregivers do not share the same disabilities as the children they're caring for, um, or it expresses itself in a different way in them. Um, and it's also for non-disabled kids because we can't change the world without them. So yes, I'll come back to that. But yeah, I just wanted to say that before I forgot. What was your question again?
Please share any feedback so far from any children reading How to Be Disabled and Proud.
So I've had like quite a few messages from parents just kind of saying, this is just so key. Thank you. It's come at the right time. My kid is experiencing X, Y, and Z, and we didn't know what to do as parents, and this is just really, really helpful. And I've had quite a few messages along that vein, which is great, and also from schools as well. Um, because quite often, I think, not always, but quite often, people who lead schools, people who work at schools, they're also a bit ill-equipped maybe to handle these conversations, to handle these situations, a lot of which happen at school, and you know, to really nurture their disabled students as much as they'd like to, or as much as those kids need it. So I've had a few messages from schools as well, which has been really lovely.
That's amazing. And I think also too for, as you so rightly say, it's for, yes, primarily for um, any children who do have a disability, but then for other children so that they can lean into that empathy and understanding as well. So I always say books are for, although it may be written for a particular subject, for every single child to enjoy different types of books and to become informed, so to speak.
I've had quite a few messages actually from people, and people have said to me as well, "Oh, well, it's for disabled kids, but I relate to this, this, and this." And I think that's really important because something that this book kind of does quite well, I think, is it shows you that we're all human and we all experiencing these things, like the worries about going to secondary school, puberty, things like that. You know, they're not exclusive to disabled kids. Everybody experiences those. It's just that we've got this extra layer that other people need to be aware of, right? Um, that we have to navigate on top of all those things. So I think, you know, I think it's so important for kids that don't have direct experience, for people that don't have direct experience, to engage in material like this. Um, because it's not just kind of building that empathy. Well, it is building empathy, but it's also, it's on a very basic level, it's humanizing people who don't look like you or behave like you. And it's giving them a voice, and it's actually, you know, it's helping them to kind of grow in their respect for people who are different than them.
Absolutely. And I think that's a great point for us to think about. And equally true, I think, you know, adults as well, albeit if it's teachers, educators, parents, caregivers, to have that deeper level of understanding. And then maybe this book could be used as a course book for different qualifications as well. And then the other thing is, I was hearing you share the beautiful summary of this book. I was thinking on some of the author visits that I do into hospitals. So hospital schools, I could see this at one particular hospital that I do go into on a regular basis. This book, How to Be Disabled and Proud, being in their hospital schoolroom for children to have a look at, either if they've come to
That would be
hospital.
amazing.
Yes, and it's just made me think I'd have to send a little email
Yeah, that would be great. Thank
across to
you.
them, because I can just actually see this book, some of the children who I've connected with on the visits, and how they're having to have an understanding in terms of what's going on for them
Mm.
from that medical point of view. And some of it, as we know, for some children going into hospital, it could just be for, you know, overnight, 3 weeks. But for some children, I've known children to have been in hospital stay from birth right up until 3, 4 that I've seen. So I could just see this book being, and especially for the older children, because when I go into the schoolroom, it's interesting that because of my books being more picture books,
Mm.
but then that older age range of children. So I think this book actually hits that spot, as you so rightly say, for children between that 8 to 12, that in between
That
type
in between
age,
time. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
because a lot of things are happening to their physical body. If I think back when I was that age, you're getting ready to go to secondary school, you're changing, you know, friendships, all these different types of things that this book, I think, beautifully covers. So, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, there's a bit on there in there about medical appointments and stuff as well, and having your voice in medical settings, which is so hard for children to do, and especially hard for disabled children, I think sometimes, because we're often kind of talked over and ignored in terms of what our wishes are for our own bodies and our own care plans. And I think so. I have quite a bit of experience of going to Great Ormond Street Hospital, and whenever I'm there, I'm reminded of, as you say, like the number of children who for whom hospital stays and hospital visits are such a routine, that as much as like going to school might be, or going to their grandparents might be, like that's how often they go. And it's almost like they're kind of living this parallel, somewhat separate life that sometimes intersects with other people's lives, but actually is quite isolated. And you know, when we're talking about disability and disabled kids and stuff, it's so I have to remind myself as well. It's so important that we don't forget the kids who are sick, who are in hospital. That these kids are worthy of all of these things and all of these experiences as well. It might look different for them, but they're worthy of it as well. And it's so important that they kind of are able to go on that journey of who they are, just like any other disabled kid is.
One of the things, picking up what you were saying in terms of the voice of the child and children's rights, and that they do have the right to express their opinion, that anything that's going to happen to them. And I think that's very important. And then coming back to, again, children who have hospital stays or who have to have regular hospital visits for different reasons. So that's really important to stress, and that it is acknowledged that children do have the right to make decisions. Absolutely. And then to the things that have an impact on them,
Yeah,
you know?
absolutely. And I think it's so important from a young age just to kind of keep them as involved as possible. Obviously, when they're very tiny, they can't make decisions, but the more you share with them from the outset, kids are smart, you know, they can and they can also handle more than we could think.
Yes.
Quite often we have this kind of I don't know, maternal or paternal instinct to like shield them from any bad news or anything that's heavy or whatever. But actually, you know, doing that kind of does them a little bit of a disservice because they're going to have to deal with it sooner or later. And the earlier we bring them into those conversations and we let them know it's okay and we inform them as much as we can, the better they will get at making those decisions, at finding ways and practicing letting their voice be heard, finding ways to do that. But we have to keep giving them that opportunity.
Exactly, exactly. And I always say it's age, stage, and ability appropriate.
Yeah.
In terms of the main caregiver of that child would know, okay, this is the time to have this particular conversation.
Yeah.
And I think, and even back from when I was a child growing up, there were certain things you were moving. I remember a colleague sharing with me when she moved on a regular basis. Her parents never told her until they were moving on that particular day. Children weren't able to go to funerals, and these discussions weren't had. But we know now, we have the language and the understanding of research and science that informs us that we should be having these conversations with children because it is important that we empower children to have a voice in decisions that are going to have an impact on them.
Absolutely. It's interesting you bring up the funeral thing because I'm just thinking about that now. And I'm thinking about how it's it's it feels like you're really robbing a child if you're not letting them know about a funeral or not letting them come because they're going to grieve too, right? And and does that mean that they're not allowed to grieve as much as you or in the same way as you? Because that doesn't feel right, you know? And yeah, it just made me think about that.
Yeah,
But
it
yeah,
is. There's a quite a lot that we're unpicking actually.
yeah, it's good. It
Which
makes for a good conversation.
it
It's
does,
good.
doesn't it? Because my mind is going like that. My dyslexic mind thinking, oh, I need to say this. We can talk about this. We can talk about that. So thank you. So in terms of this amazing book, Cathy, do you have a favourite page?
So my favourite page is actually at the end of the book. So it's a bit of a spoiler alert, but there's kind of a concluding bit that tells kids that actually it's unrealistic to expect you to be proud of who you are or of your disability all the time in a world that is quite hostile towards disability still. And I don't ever want kids to feel like they have failed because they're not always proud. Um, but what I do want them to feel like is that it's okay to have mixed feelings and it's okay to sometimes be all right with it and sometimes not be all right with it. Um, all that we can hope for as adults raising disabled children is that when they're not okay with it, they'll do something about it. They'll read this book, or they'll share with an adult that they trust, or they'll tap into a disabled network that they know well, that are experiencing the same things, and things like that. You know, this book gives so many tips as to what you can do when you're feeling a bit lost in different junctures of that age range, of that age group, and the things that you experience. And my only hope is that kids tap into that and they really utilize those tips and whenever they need them and whenever they're not feeling that proud or they're feeling a bit low, you know, they go ahead and they contact people and they do things that will help improve how they feel.
Yeah, and I quite like that point in terms of it's okay not to be feeling proud all the time. It's like when you hear people say, oh, you're dyslexic, what is your superpower? And I'm thinking, oh, well, no. And we hear that quite a lot, don't
Yeah,
we? But you
yeah,
must have a superpower. And I think for me, that puts the pressure on that individual to sometimes dig deep to think, well, I must have a superpower. Everybody's talking about having a superpower, and I think that's actually can be quite dangerous. And I think that's really, thank you for highlighting that in this book, that sometimes actually you're not going to feel proud. As some of the listeners will know, my eldest son is autistic, and even myself being dyslexic at my old age, there are some times when I feel quite embarrassed because of being verbally dyslexic, and especially on live TV. It's okay on this because we can cut things out. But I feel, and I know when I've done it, and sometimes as well, believe it or not, people can be quite cruel and laugh when I've pronounced something incorrectly, and then that will take me back to a 7-year-old child. That trauma. And it is okay not to be okay. And I think that's a wonderful message to have in that book for children with a variety of disabilities, and also to children who may have different family circumstances. This morning I'm part of the Play Commission, and I was just reading something, in terms of children who may not have access to a garden. Other children, in terms of the work that I do, that I picked up in my book, My Family, Your Family, children who may have different family setups. And for some children, their life currently isn't good for them. It isn't good for them currently for a variety of reasons, and they don't have the capacity to be proud. So that it's an amazing point. I'm going to keep on harboring on about it because I think it's wonderful.
That's kind of why the brackets are important in the title, the brackets being, so the title being How to Be Disabled and Proud, and then the brackets being, or at least kind of sort of okay with it, because it's a nod to, the fact that we might not always be okay, and we might not always even be proud, and that's okay. But yeah, you're completely right. And also, I don't ever want to be a disabled person that's telling disabled kids that are experiencing a lot more, maybe let's say pain or hostility, or sickness than I did as a child. I don't want to be like, oh, but you should be proud. It's completely unrealistic, and also I would want to punch myself in the face if that was me. But yeah, as you say, like it's important to acknowledge that we all have those up and down feelings and those mixed feelings, and that is completely expected in a world that is still quite hostile towards us.
One of the things to add there, which I think is super important, that now we know that there is so much support that children can get for their mental, emotional, and spiritual health.
Yeah.
In terms of a grown up, could be, a parent, a teacher, an educator, and there's organisations now that are able to support children with that if they're not feeling okay for a variety of reasons.
Absolutely.
Amazing.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So if I was to turn this around,
Yeah, sure.
and if you would have a question you would ask yourself about this book, what would it be?
Okay, so a question I'm asked quite a lot that we haven't covered, that I'll ask myself, I suppose, is how have you managed to cover the spectrum of disability, having only one disability yourself? Um, and so something I knew was really important was to try and get as much kind of life experience and tips from other disabled people who had completely different disabilities to my own in the book. And luckily, I have a lot of disabled friends, and I have a lot of networks I can reach out to, and lots of them feature in the book, either directly quoted, talking about their own experiences of all these things like school, gender, puberty, things like that. Um, and then others have kind of given me tips. I've sent them bits, and they've given me tips, and they've said, well, I'm not sure about this, or you could add this. And so it's never going to be completely inclusive to everybody, because I mean there's thousands of disabilities in the world, but I've tried to make it something that is relatable to as many disabled kids as possible, and that was something that was very important to me.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. It's about then you're not actually writing about every single disability. It's the principles are the same irrespective of the individual disabilities, and there are different organisations that children and their families can reach out to in relation to their own individual disabilities.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, I think some people might get misunderstand what the book's about and think, oh, it's about disabilities, but no, or it's about being a
Exactly.
disabled person. Not really. Actually, it's about what we experience in the world, and that's quite universal. And as I said before, you know, all these topics are experienced by kids, non-disabled and disabled alike. So it's actually incredibly relatable for a lot of people. It's just that the specific discrimination or inaccessibility we might face might be a little bit more unique to the specific disability, which is where I've brought in lots of other voices to share their own experiences. Like my friend Joy, who's blind, talks about navigating going to school as a person who uses a cane, and how she felt so reluctant to do that because she felt so much shame at that age of having a cane, when it's like, you know, typically associated with older people and a sign of weakness or whatever, wrongly obviously, but by children it can be, and that's such an important thing to include because I didn't have that experience, and there are many other experiences like that in the book where I'm just so thankful that that's in there, because I feel like that's going to help a blind kid who might be listening to the book. Um, yeah, so that's great.
Amazing. So in terms of children reading this book, what would you want the takeaway to be for them, the learning point?
That you belong in this world exactly as you are. You don't need to be fixed. Uh, there's nothing wrong with you. You belong as you are, and we're so glad you're here. And you know, I hope that this book helps you to feel seen and loved, and there's people who are here for you if you need it.
That's an excellent point. You are okay who you are.
Yeah.
Yeah, and not fixable.
Yeah.
And I quite like that. Exactly, exactly. And about that uniqueness as well, isn't it? And everybody's
Wouldn't
unique.
life be boring if we all look the same? Like,
Absolutely,
come on. Yeah.
absolutely.
Or if we all behave the same way.
Yes, yeah.
Um, Most of my friends are neurodivergent, and I love that. I love that they have perspectives on the world that completely turn things on their head. I'm just like, this is fantastic. Why do we have to conform to all these silly conventions all the time? It's exhausting.
Exactly. And actually they, you know, in terms of the workforce, they do say that if you have more of a diverse team, you are more to have greater positive impact because of that inclusiveness, and everybody's voice is different, you know, which is amazing. So to be different is wonderful. And this amazing book, it's such a great point to finish up on in terms of, yeah, proud. How to be disabled and proud. And we must add that bit in, or at least kind of sort of okay with it.
Yeah.
Please read
mouthful.
this book. It is absolutely amazing. And one of the things that I always say, I promote libraries and libraries. If you can, visit your local library. And to finish up on, keep reading and reading and reading. And thank you, Cathy.
Thank you so much, Laura.
You're welcome. Thank you. This podcast was woven in partnership with our friends at Tapestry, the childhood education platform. They have kindly devised the educational resources for each podcast interview. Tapestry helps you celebrate children's learning, improve communication with families, and streamline your admin with powerful booking, invoicing, and management tools, giving you more time for what matters, the children and you. Visit tapestry.info to find out more. This podcast series was recorded at the Quick Brown Fox Video Production Studios in Wandsworth Town, London, with top-notch equipment and a knowledgeable team who are always happy to help. Recording our podcast has been a breeze.